is Ras Timotheos, High Priest of Temple Divine, um, Temple Divine of the Indigenous Peoples and Native American temple related to Yah indwelling the science of metaphysics and the science of spirituality involving the cultivation of the higher self, the cultivation of Yah indwelling. And I would like to share a little bit today about the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Now, the Temple of Divine is a Native American temple, the Holy Temple of Yah, and this includes us as Native American Indigenous peoples and those of the Hebrew Israelite nations, the nations of Israel, and those who share the covenant with Israel. The United Nations have declared that Native peoples or indigenous peoples have certain specific rights, and this was actually produced recently in 2006. And so I wanted to go over a couple of things involving this United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples so that we get a better understanding. It's about the understanding so that we have it, so that we are able to grow. And with understanding, we are able to expand our minds towards Yah. And so one thing is not to forget that our forefathers, the Hebrew Israelites, have made a covenant with Yah, and that covenant, both the old and new, still stands. And so it's important to dwell on that aspect as well, because that all of this corresponds with international law. So let's get into this. Let's see. I'm going to share my screen real fast. Okay, hopefully you guys can see that. Okay. So, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I'll put a link to this in the description box. So let's go to the next page. Okay. Resolution adopted by General Assembly, affirming, encouraging. Okay. So Article 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to full enjoyment as a collective or as individuals of all human rights and fundamental freedoms as recognized in the Charter of United Nations, the Universal Declarations of the Human Rights, and the International Human Rights Law. Article 2. Indigenous peoples and individuals are free and equal to all other peoples and individuals and have the right to be free from any kind of discrimination in the exercise of their rights, in particular that based on their indigenous origin or identity. Now, this includes you so-called Negroes, Blacks, Coloreds, Latin Americans, all these terms, Native American. These terms are not the true and correct terms for which we are. We are the Ibri, we are the Hebrew Israelites. We are descendants of the Hebrew Israelites. We are the Ibri people. Now, Article 3 states that indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. Now, self-determination is one of the most important things about the Temple Divine. It's the faculty in which allows you to determine your political and social and cultural status as well as development. It says, Article 3, the second part, by virtue of the right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. So self-determination is one of the most important things in involving one's spirituality and culture. So, Article 4. Indigenous peoples, in exercising their right to self-determination, have the right to autonomy of self-government in matters relating to their internal local affairs, as well as ways and means for financing their autonomous functions. So, we are the Hebrew Israelite nation. We are of the Hebrew Israelite nation. So therefore, according to that covenant we made with Yah, we have our ability to this self-determination and to govern ourselves, to be, free to finance our own autonomous functions. So Article 5 states that indigenous people have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinct political, legal, economic, social, and cultural institutions while retaining their right to participate fully, if they so choose, in the political, economic, and social and cultural life of the state. Now, the state in the Bible could be equated to Egypt. Now, the Israelites must return to Yah, and to return to Yah, that means they come back and choose to gain the political, economic, and social and cultural benefit of Yah, of the life of Yah. But in this Article 5, it's stating that we have, as indigenous peoples, have the right to choose in political, economic, and social and cultural life of the state. So there's a choice. Article 6. Every indigenous individual has the right to a nationality. Now, Article 6 is the next important article, including the self-determination, because this deals with nationality. This deals with how we are recognized nationality among all nations of the world. So we are known as the Hebrew Israelites, and of the nation of the Ibri, or the nation of Yah Elohim, the kingdom of Israel. Now, Article 7 describes these indigenous individual rights. So, Article 7, Part 1, indigenous individuals have the right to life, physical and mental integrity, liberty, and security of person. Part 2, indigenous peoples have the collective right to live in freedom, peace, and security as distinct peoples, and shall not be subject to any act of genocide or any other act of violence, including forcibly removing children of the group to another group. Article 8. 1. Indigenous peoples and individuals have the right not to be subject to forced assimilation or destruction of their culture. Now, we've seen in the past American history this very thing, the assimilation of the Native Americans, as well as the so-called slaves, and as well as the dark-skinned, copper-colored Native Americans as well, to this aspect of forced assimilation and destruction of culture. So this is redeeming us in the sense of our political and national understanding. So Part 2 of Article 8 states, states shall provide effective mechanisms for prevention of and redress for a. any action which has the aim or effect of depriving them of their integrity as a distinct peoples, or of their cultural values or ethnic identities. B. any action which has the aim or effect of dispossessing them of their lands, territories, or resources. C. any form of forced population transfer which has the aim or effect of violating or undermining any of their rights. D. Any form of forced assimilation or integration. E. Any form of propaganda designed to promote or incite racial or ethnic discrimination directed against them. And there also is anti-Semitic laws that are enforced in some cases not enforced, but um, that's a different subject in and of itself. Article 9, Indigenous peoples and individuals have the right to belong to to an indigenous community or nation. So we have the right to belong to the nation of Israel, the Native American indigenous community of the Hebrew Israelite nation, in accordance with the traditions and customs of their community or nation concerned. So this includes all the customs, the practices that are practiced within the temple divine. Um, and it says no discrimination of any kind may arise from the exercise of such right. So Article 10, indigenous people shall not be forcibly removed from their lands or territories. No relocation shall take place without the free, prior, and informed consent of the indigenous peoples concerned, and after agreement on just and fair compensation, and where possible, with the option of return. Now, Article 11. 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to practice and revitalize their cultural traditions and customs. This includes the right to maintain, protect, and develop the past, present, and future manifestations of their cultures, such as archaeological and historical sites, artifacts, designs, ceremonies, technologies, and visual and performing arts and literature. Okay, I don't really have to explain that, but that in and of itself involves our traditions, our cultural traditions and customs, literature, as well as our arts, artifacts, historical sites, ceremonies, and things of that nature, the manifestation of the culture. So, number 2, states shall provide redress through effective mechanisms, which may include restitution developed in conjunction with the indigenous peoples with respect to their culture, intellectual, religious, and spiritual property taken without their free, prior, and informed consent or in violation of their laws, traditions, and customs. So remember, refer back to the law of the Hebrew Israelites, the Torah, right? Article 12. Indigenous people have the right to manifest, practice, develop, and teach their spiritual and religious traditions, customs, and ceremonies, the right to maintain, protect, and have access in privacy to their religious and cultural sites. This includes the lands of the West, the mound builders, those of you Hebrew Israelites, which come from those people who build those mounds, as well as those who build the pyramids over here on the native lands of the Americas, as well as those who built the pyramids in North African plains. So it also says that that the right to use and control of the ceremonial objects and the right to repatriation of their human remains. Article 12, number 2 states, states shall seek and enable the access or repatriation of ceremonial objects and have remains in their possession through fair, transparent, and effective mechanisms developed in conjunction with indigenous peoples concerned. Next page. Article 13. 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to revitalize, use, develop, and transmit to future generations their histories, languages, oral traditions, philosophies, writing systems, and literatures, and to designate and retain their own names of communities, places, and persons. So we have the right to name ourselves. We have the right to transmit and develop and revitalize our histories, languages, oral traditions, philosophies, writing systems, literatures, and those things. So Article 13, number 2 states, states shall have or take effective measures to ensure that this right is protected, and also to ensure that indigenous peoples can understand and be understood in political, legal, and administrative processing where necessary, through the provision of interpretation or by other appropriate means. Article 14. Indigenous peoples have the right to establish and control their educational systems and institutions providing education in their own languages in a manner appropriate to their cultural methods of teaching and learning. 2. Indigenous individuals, particularly children, have the right to all levels of forms of education of the state without discrimination. 3. States shall, in conjunction with indigenous people, take effective measures in order for indigenous individuals, particularly children, including those living outside their communities, to have access, when possible, to an education in their own culture and provided in their own language. Article 15. 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to the dignity and diversity of their cultures, traditions, histories, and aspirations, with which shall be appropriately reflected in education and public information. 2. States shall take effective measures in consultation and cooperation with the indigenous peoples concerned to combat the prejudice and eliminate discrimination, and to promote tolerance, understanding, and good relations among indigenous peoples in all other segments of society. Article 16. 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to establish their own media in their own languages and to have access to all forms of non-indigenous media without discrimination. 2. States shall take effective measures to ensure that the state-owned media duly reflect indigenous culture diversity. States, without prejudice to ensuring full freedom of expression, should encourage privately owned media to accurately reflect indigenous cultural diversity. Article 17. 1. The indigenous individuals and people have the right to fully enjoy all the rights established under the applicable international and domestic labor laws. So this is working for those Hebrew Israelites that would like to work and provide a means for their family to have food if they do not grow their own foods. So number 2, states shall, in consultation and cooperation with indigenous peoples, take specific measures to protect indigenous children from economic exploitation and from performing any work that is likely to be hazardous or to interfere with the child's education or to be harmful to the child's health or physical, mental, spiritual, moral, or social development, taking into account their special vulnerability and the importance of education for their empowerment. Number 3, indigenous individuals have the right not to be subject to any discriminatory conditions of labor and inter alia employment or salary. Article 18. Indigenous people have the right to participate in decision making in matters which would affect their rights through representatives chosen by themselves in accordance with their own procedures, as well as to maintain and develop their own indigenous decision-making institutions. Article 19. States shall consult and cooperate in good faith with the indigenous peoples concerned through their own representative institutions in order to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent before adapting and implementing legislature or administrative measures that may affect them. So this means that we can create our own government in which can speak to and cooperate and develop certain treaties and things of that nature with outside individuals. So Article 19, states shall consult and cooperate. Oh, we read that one. Article 20, 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and develop their political, economic, and social systems or institutions to be secure in the enjoyment of their own means of subsistence and development, and to engage freely in all their traditional and other economic activities. 2. Indigenous peoples deprived of their means of subsistence and development are entitled to just and fair redress. Article 21. 1. Indigenous peoples have the right without discrimination to the empowerment of their economic and social conditions, including inter alia in the areas of education, employment, vocational training and retraining, housing, sanitation, health, and social security. 2. States shall take effective measures and, where appropriate, special measures to ensure continuing improvement of their economic and social conditions. Particular attention shall be paid to the rights and special needs of Indigenous elders, women, youth, children, and persons with disabilities. Article 22. 1. Particular attention shall be paid to the rights and special needs of Indigenous elders, women, youth, children, and persons with disabilities, and implementation of this declaration. 2. States shall take measures in conjunction with Indigenous peoples to ensure that Indigenous women and children enjoy full protection and guarantees against all forms of violence and discrimination. Article 23. Indigenous peoples have the right to determine and develop priorities and strategies for exercising the right to development. In particular, Indigenous people have the right to be actively involved in developing and determining health, housing, and other economic and social programs affecting them, and, as far as possible, to administer such programs through their own institutions. 24. Oh, too far. Let me see. I went too far. Sorry about that. Okay. We'll start at Article 30. I'm not sure if we were at Article 30 or not, but we'll start at Article 30. And you can just refer back to the link in the description, and that will lead you to this, and you can read it for yourself. Article 30. Military activities shall not take place in their lands or territories of Indigenous peoples unless justified by a relevant public interest or otherwise freely agreed with or requested by the Indigenous peoples concerned. 2. States shall undertake effective consultations with the Indigenous peoples concerned through appropriative procedures, and in particular through their representative institutions, prior to using their lands or territories for military activities. Article 31. 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional and cultural expressions, as well as the manifestations of their sciences, technologies, and cultures, including human and genetic resources, seeds, medicines, knowledge, and of properties of fauna and flora, oral traditions, literatures, designs, sports, and traditional games, and visual and performing arts. They also have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their intellectual property over such cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions. 2. In conjunction with the Indigenous people, states shall take effective measures to recognize and protect the exercise of these rights. Article 32. 1. Indigenous people have the right to determine and develop priorities and strategies for development or use of their lands or territories and other resources. Now I'm going to skip down to Article 33. Indigenous peoples have the right to determine their own identity or membership in accordance with their customs and traditions. So this includes creating identity cards or things of that nature. This does not impair the right of indigenous peoples to obtain citizenship of the states which they live. 2. Indigenous peoples have the right to determine the structures and to select the membership of their institutions in accordance with their own procedures. So that includes the Temple Divine and the procedures therein. So Article 34, Indigenous people have the right to promote, develop, and maintain their institutional structures and their distinctive customs, spirituality, traditions, procedures, practices, and in the cases where they exist, judicial systems or customs in accordance with international human rights standards. Article 35. Indigenous people have the right to determine the responsibilities of individuals to their communities. Article 36. Indigenous peoples, in particular those divided by international borders, have the right to maintain and develop contacts, relations, and cooperation, including activities for spiritual, cultural, political, economic, and social purposes with their own members as well as other peoples across borders. 2. States in consultation and cooperation with indigenous peoples shall take effective measures to facilitate the exercise and ensure the implementation of this right. Article 37. 1. Indigenous people have the right to recognition, observance, and enforcement of treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements conducted with states or their own successors, to have states honor and respect such treaties, agreements, and other constructive agreements. This includes the Torah. This includes the covenant of the Hebrew Israelite nation. Article 38. States in consultation and in cooperation with indigenous people shall take appropriate measures, including legislative measures, to achieve the ends of this declaration. Article 39. Indigenous people have the right to access to financial and technical assistance from states and through international cooperation from the enjoyment of rights contained in this declaration. Article 40. Indigenous people have the right to access to the prompt decision through just and fair procedures for the resolution of conflicts and disputes with states and other parties, as well as effective remedies for all infringements of their individual and collective rights, such a decision shall give due consideration to the customs, traditions, rules, and legal systems of the indigenous peoples concerned and international human rights. Article 41, Article 42, Article 43, Article 44. I'm not going to read the rest of these, but as you can see, we have the rights of indigenous people that give us protection to the practices, the customs, our arts, and all of these things from discrimination and the things that have been mentioned herein. Now, I appreciate you guys tuning in to view and get an understanding of this, and this will be the end of this video. I'll see you in the next video. Thank you for coming by again and listening to this presentation. Once again, this is Ras Timotheos. Peace.